People, what were the dark family secrets you were finally let in on once you were old enough? When I was growing up, my dad would frequently travel overseas to Europe about 3 or 4 times a year. Every time I asked where he was going or why, it was always brushed off, and he'd be gone anywhere from a couple of weeks to a month. The trips stopped altogether when I was around 14. We weren't poor, but we certainly weren't well off enough to afford that many trips. Yet, somehow, they kept happening. Fast forward 4 years. I'm 18, getting ready to move out, and my dad takes me on a drive to a nearby town, about 2 hours away. It seemed like a random trip, just to enjoy the scenery, but I figured something was up. He starts telling me this wild story. Apparently, our family was part of a much larger family from Italy. 7 or 10 generations ago, the family had 8 daughters, each of whom married and started their own family. My dad hinted that the father of these daughters had left behind a huge inheritance, but it was only to be passed down to the surviving family. Over the next few centuries, the descendants of these women were constantly trying to end each other. When they weren't doing that, they were outbreeding one another. He told me about cousins being taken on ships, coming back years later to get revenge for unaliving their fathers. It was some seriously operatic stuff. Anyway, shortly after I was born, my dad learned that one of the cousins from this family line was still alive and actively plotting to end our family. His brother was stuck in Venezuela and his sister was in Argentina, so they'd pay for my dad to fly out and track this guy down. He'd spend weeks or even a month looking for him. The cousin tried to unalive him several times, and my dad showed me some gnarly scars he definitely didn't have when I was younger. In 1998, he finally tracked the guy down in Sardinia and ended him. He told me this in a way that made me believe him. He also said it wasn't the first relative he'd had to eliminate. He wanted me to know all this in case anything happened to him, or if someone threatened me or my family, so I'd understand why. We finished the drive, picked up some deli meat and bread, and made sandwiches on the trunk of the car. We talked about our plans for the evening. He and I were supposed to go deer hunting that season, and he wanted me to come spotting with him up one of the local mountains. I had a class I could have skipped, but I told him I wanted to go because it was an important subject I enjoyed. That evening, midway through class, the police knocked on the door and asked me to step outside. Some hikers had found my dad, unconscious on the mountain. He'd been gone for a few hours, near a major trail and close to his truck. He had his cell phone with him. The police thought it was a massive heart attack, which made sense. He had a bad heart and wasn't in the best health. But it was suspicious. He'd barely been out on the mountain, and the hikers just found him within a few hours. I pushed my mom for an autopsy, but she refused, saying she just wanted to handle his cremation. Nothing strange has happened since, but I'll probably always wonder what really happened to him. Sorry if you were expecting a treasure story or something supernatural. My dad always said he never saw or heard anything about an inheritance, and no one in the family knew of anything either. It seems like after the first generation, the family just kept ending each other because that's all they'd ever known. Before we continue, do us a quick favor. Smash that like button and subscribe to support our channel. Story 2. I wouldn't say this was a family secret that I was eventually let in on, but more of a secret I stumbled upon when I definitely shouldn't have. My father wasn't in my life, and my mother did her best to raise me on her modest income, with a lot of help from my grandparents. My grandmother, who is still alive today, is easily the kindest, most wholesome person I've ever known. My grandfather, on the other hand, was a tough, no-nonsense countryman. As a toddler, I grew up watching old Clint Eastwood films and honestly thought for a long time that my grandfather was Philo Beto from Any Which Way But Loose. He looked so much like Clint. He was my father figure, the one who taught me how to hunt and fish. A Depression-era kid, he made sure we never went without and that we knew how to survive. As I got older, I learned that my granddad had done time and was actually a felon. He had a criminal past, and all those hunting trips where he carried weapons legally, well, he could have been locked up for that. He did time for crippling a man at a party with a crowbar, something that was likely fueled by alcohol, but the specifics were hazy. He was a rough man, quiet, and he had a mumbled voice, a habit I had to break as I grew older. He even had his Adam's apple caved in during a bar fight, leaving him with a raspy voice like Daffy Duck. But this story isn't just about him. Things take a much darker turn. My granddad had a group of friends he hung out with, doing redneck things like hunting and fishing. By the time he passed, The only one still around was the youngest of the group and the one closest to him. We'll call him Texas. Texas was by far the most redneck person I ever met. Big 10-gallon hat, no shirt, and a Bowie knife on his waist at all times. My granddad passed when I was in my mid-teens, and after that, Texas stepped in to show me the ropes. He was a man's man, but also a smart one. He had interests in philosophy, art, and music. He wasn't just about the redneck lifestyle. He could cook too, and every year, long before I was born, he hosted a massive 4th of July party with barbecue, catfish, and illegal fireworks from other states. But our story takes a dark turn, and a family secret came to light the night before one of my last hunting trips with Texas, just before an unexpected heart attack claimed his life. It was a typical weekend evening. Texas was drinking when my mom dropped me off at his house, where I'd stay the night before we hit the land early the next morning. As soon as my mom left, Texas handed me a beer, and we sat around chatting with another friend of his. Eventually, his friend left, and things grew quieter. Texas started reminiscing about my granddad, about how much he missed him, and how proud my granddad would have been of how I was turning out. I asked him to tell me some stories from the good old days, and he shared a few wild tales about the things they'd gotten up to. Texas was a big guy, broad-shouldered, and he once had to pay court fees for beating up 4 bouncers at a bar in Indiana. Stories like that, stuff you'd expect from a rough man. And then, he let something slip that I'll never forget. See, there's a lot of bad in this world. Your granddaddy and I both knew that. Sometimes when we ran into bad folk, we made them disappear. You'd be surprised how much it tastes like barbecue when done right. At the time, I laughed it off, assuming it was just a joke. I was a few beers deep, after all. But years later, after Texas passed away, remains were discovered in his backyard, the same backyard where we'd had those 4th of July cookouts, where barbecue was served up every year. Story 3. I found out that my uncle was a wannabe artist. He was always charming, charismatic, and dressed impeccably, like a successful businessman. At family gatherings, he'd give me little gifts, like foreign coins or paper money from different countries. He had a loud laugh and loved to tell grand stories. But there was one thing I noticed. My mom and her siblings always seemed a little uncomfortable around him, despite his obvious coolness. I used to think they were just jealous because we lived in small suburbs in the Midwest, while he had made it big in Chicago. At least that's how I saw it growing up. When I was a teenager, he went through a divorce, and I didn't see him as much. But whenever he did show up, he'd have a different girlfriend, which, at the time, didn't seem out of the ordinary. That all changed the summer after my freshman year of college. I was home at my parents' house when an angry man called, furious and demanding to know where my uncle was. When I told him I didn't know, he accused me of lying and covering for him. But honestly, I didn't have any clue where he was. The older I got, the more I saw my uncle as an unbearable person, and the less I saw him at family events, so I truly had no information about him. The man eventually hung up, and later that night, I asked my parents what that was all about. That's when they told me the truth. My uncle was a con artist. He'd wine and dine women, putting on the facade of a wealthy businessman. He'd earn their trust, date them for a while, and then slowly gather their personal information. Once he had enough, he'd take as much of their money as he could and disappear. Apparently, the discomfort I'd noticed was because my aunts, uncles, and even my grandma had bailed him out over the years. He'd tell them that he'd fallen on hard times, that he needed money, that it was just a low moment, a mistake. Each time, they'd give him around $10,000 to get by. But the most devastating part was that he took the most from my grandma, who, in her later years, needed her savings for elder care. By then, she had dementia, which made it even more despicable. No one knew that the others had helped him out until people started calling, demanding information about him. That's when the family finally put all the pieces together. Story 4. It's not super dark, but I found out that my mom and her best friend met because my dad had been dating them both at the same time. My dad chose my mom over her, and then my mom's future best friend ended up marrying my dad's best friend, even though she has been miserable in the marriage. Some people, though not my mom, surprisingly, think she married him to stay close to my dad. My mom is so likable, though, that she just kind of won her over. The best friend is still bitter about the whole thing, but she never took it out on my mom since my mom wasn't involved. Learning this finally made sense of why, whenever I was alone with her, She was so emotionally abusive towards me. As a young child, it scared me so much I never told my parents about it until I was old enough to confront her about it. Once I did, it stopped. She loves me now, but as a kid, she despised me because I had my dad's personality in a little girl's body. It was like she wanted to treat my dad the way she treated me, but couldn't. The damage my dad caused is real, though, because some of the things she said to me were pretty dark. Story 5. My father was married to another woman before he met my mother. They had a daughter, and my dad loved her dearly, but his wife became incredibly jealous of the bond they shared. He started noticing strange behavior from her toward the girl, and when he tried to talk to her about it, they got into an argument. My dad ended up leaving with his daughter and going to stay at my uncle's house. The woman knew that my dad would leave his daughter with my aunt while he went to work, so she called the police, claiming that my aunt had kidnapped her child. The police arrived and took the girl from my aunt. Later, the woman returned home, put poison in her daughter's milk, and forced her to drink it. When my dad arrived, he found his daughter unconscious, left alone in the house. The woman was never found, and my father never received any justice for his first child. It's a heartbreaking story. When I was born, my mother decided to name me after my sister. We share the same name, and that's how I found out about her. I asked my parents about my name, and they shared the whole story with me. I know this sounds messed up and cruel, but with everything that's happened in my family, this just feels like another chapter in the chaos. My dad has moved on, and he's doing all right now. I have 4 siblings, and we're all okay. This took place in Anápolis, Brazil, in the 80s, and it was reported in the local news. Story 6. When I was younger, I found some love letters addressed to my mother from a man named Pete. The letters spoke about how he had fond memories of their secret relationship back in college at LSU. They mentioned her attending his basketball games in the early 70s and how he was always worried his main girlfriend would catch them. It was all really strange, and I didn't think much about it at the time, until I remembered an argument between my parents. My dad had caught her with a tall guy in a car just before they were married. She insisted it was just an old friend from college, but she quickly shut down the conversation. At the time, I didn't think much of it. But here's the thing. My mom was 5 feet 9 inches with red hair, and my dad was 6 with dark hair. Neither of them had blonde hair, and no one in our family was taller than 6 feet 4 inches. Yet, I'm 6 feet 7 inches, blonde, and better at basketball than anyone else in my family. Years later, after my mom got sick, I found the letters again. It became pretty clear that the man writing the letters was Pistol Pete Maravich. He talked about his life in basketball frequently, and the details added up. 2 of the letters were dated after I was born, and the tone was different. One asked how things were going, and the last one said he wished things had been different, but that, due to the situation, they should never talk again. He said it would be better for everyone. Now that both my parents have passed away, I got both a 23andMe and Ancestry DNA kit, but I can't bring myself to send them in. Story 7. After my grandparents met, my grandfather's family had him thrown into an asylum to seize his inheritance. My paternal grandfather met my grandmother when he was 37 and she was 19, only semi-scandalous. Shortly after they met, my grandfather's father passed away, and he became deeply depressed and withdrawn during the finalization of my great-grandfather's will, where my grandfather was supposed to inherit the majority of the estate and farm. Seeing an opportunity, his mother, 2 sisters, and their husbands conspired to take most of the inheritance for themselves. They convinced a hospital that my grandfather's depression was actually schizophrenia and had him sent to an asylum, which made it easy for his family to claim the estate. After a year in the asylum, my grandmother, now 21, finally managed to sign him out into her care. But during his time in the asylum, he underwent experimental shock therapy, which left him with a fractured mind. It was heartbreaking, especially since he had been an incredibly talented GP who often treated people for free. When he returned home, he discovered that his mother and sisters had sold off large parts of the farm and used the money to build lavish homes and buy beach houses. The only piece of land they left him was the most rocky and infertile part of the original farm, the same farm I grew up on. I've read his journals from before and after his time in the asylum, and you can see a dramatic shift in his thoughts and handwriting. He was a very different, fractured man after his ordeal. I only found this out when I was 24 from my father's cousin, the daughter of one of the sisters. Story 8. My father met my mother in the Philippines while he was stationed there in the Navy. They married, and shortly after, I was conceived. He then had to finish his tour of duty. My mother moved to the United States when she was just a month away from giving birth to me, settling in Texas with relatives. My father's tour ended while he was in Hawaii, where he met another woman. He called my mom in America and asked for a divorce, wanting to back out of his marriage to her, while she was pregnant with his child, because he had a fling. My mother, already frightened in a new country and not speaking much English, was now dealing with the fact that her husband was abandoning her as she was about to give birth. In response, my Texan uncle flew to Hawaii, ready to confront my father. He somehow convinced him to step up, take responsibility for his family, and honor his commitments. The fact that the woman had dumped him probably helped with the persuasion. My father was back in time for my birth. I didn't learn about this until I was 11, around the time my parents divorced. It turned out to be just the first of many dark family secrets I would uncover throughout my teenage years. Story 9. My usually calm and conservative Christian mother casually mentioned that she once dated a gangster who did some dirty work in New York during the 80s. He even bought her a brand new BMW before being sentenced to over 20 years in prison for offing a person. To make things even wilder, someone who had been friends with both her and her ex for years turned out to be an FBI informant. My mother narrowly avoided jail time, had to enter witness protection, and moved across the country. Here's the craziest part. He's still stalking her. Every year, without fail, he contacts her on her birthday, and he keeps track of her. My dad has no idea. I asked her why she waited so long to tell me all of this. I mean, what if something happened to her? Her response? Oh, honey, if he wanted to harm me, I'd already be gone by now. Very reassuring. Story 10. It wasn't really much of a secret, but it took me a while to understand what was actually happening. My mom used to have us play a game called Army, which involved me, my mom, and my siblings army crawling around our apartment, kind of like a game of hide and seek. She would randomly yell, "Hit the deck!" and we'd all drop and scramble to find a hiding spot. We'd giggle endlessly while my mom crawled around looking for us. It was one of our favorite games. It wasn't until a few years ago, when I was retelling the story, that I realized we lived in a pretty rough neighborhood. I figured out that she'd yell, "Hit the deck!" when she heard gunshots outside the building. I'm guessing she was trying to protect us from potential stray bullets. Story 11. My grandpa was an alcoholic and a complete jerk. He was a terrible father and husband. He abused my mom, my two uncles, and my grandma, and they were terrified whenever he came home drunk. They'd hide under their beds for hours until he finally passed out. My grandma had cancer and almost passed away when she was in her 40s. My mom had to take care of her all on her own, traveling to the hospital an hour away. The only thing my grandpa ever said was that he hoped that grandma would just pass away already. My mom was only 18 at the time and had to balance caring for her mom with finishing her apprenticeship. A lot of people in the city knew who my grandpa was because he had some job that was somewhat important, though I'm not really sure what it was. Everyone always recognized me by my last name and would talk about how much they liked him and how lucky I was to have a grandpa like him. They had no idea what he was really like. Story 12. Mine's more of a cool story than a horrifying one, and I'm honestly proud of it. My grandfather was an incredible man. He served as a sniper paratrooper in World War II and was always tight-lipped about his time in the Army. I later learned that he was dishonorably discharged after an injury. Turns out, his squad sergeant was a real jerk. My grandfather and his spotter partner were supposed to set up a post behind enemy lines, but the plane was flying too low for a safe jump. My grandfather protested, and the sergeant, calling him a coward, shoved him out of the plane. Both he and his partner were badly injured in the landing. His partner, whom I never knew, was paralyzed and lost a leg. My grandfather broke both his legs, his arm, hand, and some ribs. They were rescued shortly after and taken to a military hospital, but that's not what got him discharged. It happened when the sergeant came to visit them in the infirmary. My grandfather, with his only good hand, punched him square in the face twice. According to his only Army buddy, who was also visiting, my grandfather knocked him out. After that, and with his injuries, the Army sent him home for the rest of the war. When my grandfather passed away and we went through his things, we found newspaper clippings and articles about the people involved, which he had kept. The sergeant was later discharged after another incident that cost the lives of two other men in his squad. He ended up drinking himself to death years later. We also found unsent letters my grandfather had written to the sergeant and photos of his squad, including the 2 men who died with him. It was heartbreaking. I never knew any of this. He was such a fun, kind, goofy guy, and you'd never imagine he had such a history. Now I understand why my parents always said never to bring up the army around him. Miss you, Grandpa. I would have punched that bastard too. Story 13. Grandma had 13 siblings, and out of those, 7 women are still alive. Every year, they have a sister day where all but one of them goes somewhere together to have fun. They've been doing this since their teenage years. There's one sister, though, who has been lied to her whole life about Sister Day because she thinks it doesn't exist. The whole thing apparently started when she borrowed something and didn't return it, or something trivial like that. Whenever we all get together, pre-pandemic, we're reminded that we're not supposed to talk about it because it would hurt that one sister. I still can't wrap my head around how petty and backstabbing some of my family members can be. Honestly, it just feels stupid. Story 14. When I was young, I thought it was really nice that my Nana lived with my aunt and her family since she was getting older. It meant she was looked after and always had people around. My aunt has 6 kids. Occasionally, my aunt would complain about being the one to care for Nana, and as a kid, I sympathized. But since everyone spent a lot of time with her, I didn't think much of it. Mainly because, as a child, you don't think about financial responsibilities, just the social and emotional aspects. It turns out, the real reason Nana lived with my aunt is because my aunt and her husband convinced Nana to put the house in their name so they could manage her affairs. They sold it out from under her and invested the money in a pyramid scheme, so it's all gone now. As a result, her siblings refuse to help my aunt with any money for Nana's care, since it's my aunt's fault Nana has no assets left. Instead, they pay for Nana's outings, meals, shopping, and activities to make sure she doesn't go without, but leave my aunt to bear the full cost of Nana's living expenses. Since my aunt's kids are all independent now, they aren't affected by the financial strain. Now, looking back, I can't help but feel disgusted by my aunt's griping. I think she's a terrible person. Story 15. My grandmother was in an abusive relationship from the time she was 19. Her boyfriend, an alcoholic, frequently essayed her, and as a result, she became pregnant. In the 50s, pregnancy outside of marriage was scandalous, so they had to marry quickly. They had 5 children together, though one did not survive childbirth. The other 3 lived. Throughout this time, her husband's alcoholism and extreme abuse continued. My grandmother was forced to escape. If she hadn't, she likely wouldn't have survived. During her escape, she met my grandfather, and they fell in love. She left her children with her mother, who had custody of them at the time, and my grandfather sold his only possession, a small moped, to help her escape. Years later, after my grandmother divorced her first husband, married my grandfather, had 3 more children, and moved back to her hometown, things seemed to be going well. She reconnected with her first 4 daughters, and everything was fine, except for one thing. In their small town, everyone knew everyone, and rumors spread quickly. One such rumor was that my grandmother had an affair with another man while she was married to her first husband, and one of her daughters was his child, not her husband's. The daughters hadn't known about this until they heard the rumor. When they confronted my grandmother, she was stunned and denied it, insisting it wasn't true and that the matter should be put to rest. But the daughters were unsettled, so they decided to take a DNA test. When the results came back, it was clear the rumor wasn't just gossip, it was true. Daughter number 3 was, in fact, a half-sister to the other 3. They went to my grandmother with the proof, but she still denied it, despite the evidence being right in front of her. This led to the daughters cutting off all contact with her. They never got over the fact that she had left them in the first place, and this betrayal was the final straw. I can't really blame them for that. To this day, my grandmother insists that nothing happened and that all 4 daughters are from the same father. Story 16. I found out that my cousin is actually my half-brother. My mom got pregnant in college, and my aunt and uncle ended up adopting him. Then, I learned that my dad isn't my biological father. After my mom and dad divorced, she got pregnant by another man. My dad couldn't have kids of his own, so they remarried, and he raised me as his own. Story 17. We found out by accident, but apparently, my dad's first love and he were in a serious car crash when he was 25, and she passed away. He ended up living with her father for years after her death. Even 30 years later, her father still visits my dad. We were always told he was just a mentor until my sister pressed my mom about it. One of my sisters is even named after the girl who died, her middle name, and we never knew about her until last year. None of us have ever brought it up with my dad. Story 18. My step-grandfather had always been an alcoholic. When I was a kid, around 6 years old, he even taught me how to mix his favorite drink. I'd mix it just the way he liked and bring it to him in the living room. I don't even remember what the drink was, but he always acted funny. I enjoyed spending time with him because I found him funny, so I never saw the darker side of his alcoholism. He never pressured me to drink, and he didn't have any negative impact on me directly. However, before I was born, he'd get so drunk that he threatened to off my grandma. After a car accident, when he came home bleeding from his head, he started claiming that my grandma shot him. He even threw out some of the wedding pictures my parents had. I never knew how bad he really was. Maybe it was because he liked kids, but he always made me cocoa and watched Garfield with me when I was young. To me, he was never a bad influence. It was strange to learn all those things about him. Before he died, he deeply regretted his drinking and completely stopped. He became really depressed, but when his biological granddaughter was born, he was so happy. He passed away regretting everything, but as a sober man who was grateful to meet his one and only biological granddaughter. Despite everything, he changed in the end, and when he died, everyone was truly upset. Story 19. I found out that my favorite cousin wasn't actually missing. Growing up, all I knew was that he came and went a lot. He lived with us when I was a baby, and after he moved out, he'd visit about once every 6 months, but we never visited him or reached out. His visits were some of my favorite moments. I loved him like a brother. By the time I was a teenager, I understood that he had issues with his parents. They had kicked him out when he was 13, and my parents took him in, but that kind of childhood messes with you. Between his visits to our house, he avoided the rest of the family, moved around a lot, and didn't hold jobs for long, which is why my parents often didn't know where he was. But then, in my later teens, he stopped coming around altogether. I asked about him constantly, but was told no one had heard from him or had any contact information. He'd show up when he felt like it. The years went by, and I began to worry he might be dead. I missed him so much. In my late 20s, I finally found out the truth. Everyone knew where he was all along. He was in prison for offing a person. From what I heard, it was somewhat justified. He was defending his new wife, someone I never got to meet. I also learned some really ugly truths about how the extended family sided with his messed up parents and refused to help him or his wife when he was arrested. They even shamed my dad into not helping him, too. I tried to send him a message in prison, but I don't know if he ever got it. I just wish he knew that I never turned my back on him for all those years. I just didn't know what had happened. Story 20. This isn't about me, but a family friend of ours passed away last year. We met through our daughters, who did karate together. I was close friends with both him and his wife, and I'm still in touch with her. He was already in his 70s when we met, and his wife was about 20 years younger than him. He had such a fascinating life story, and I wanted to record it for his daughter. She was going through a tough time as a young teen, and her behavior towards him was really difficult. Based on my own challenging teenage years and my relationship with my dad, I thought that one day, she might want to get to know him better, especially since he was already quite old and not in the best health. I didn't want her to only get to know him as an adult, so I felt it was important to help her connect with him through his stories. So, I spent several hours with him, recording his life experiences. It was really interesting, and I was proud to be able to preserve those memories for his daughter. After he passed away, I sent the recordings to his wife on USB drives. She got back to me and told me they had just thrown them away. Eventually, it came out that he had essayed his daughter. I was absolutely gutted, feeling betrayed and angry at this man who had always seemed so fun, funny, and a bit ornery. Story 21. My cousins lived with us for a while, and we thought it was great. It felt like a sleepover every day. One time, our mom even took us out of school to pick them up. I found out later that the reason they moved in with us was because Child Protective Services had taken them from their mom due to mental health issues. My mom offered to take in her sister's kids until she could get her mental health back on track. Now, my cousins live with their mom again, and she's in a much better place mentally. Story 22. Grandma didn't move in with us because she wanted to spend more time with us. She moved in because her son, my uncle, was an addict who convinced her to put his name on the house, take all the money out of it for renovations, and then left her homeless. She had a heart attack the night she found out and now has to live with a pacemaker. Screw you, Uncle Roy. Story 23. I'm still at least one family secret. I'm adopted and recently found my biological father. He begged me not to reach out to any of my half-siblings, saying it would ruin his life and standing in the community. The sad part is, I'm not even his first secret child. There's an older half-sister, too, whom he also begged not to contact anyone in the family. So, that's 2 kids he's had because he cheated on his wife. I can only imagine how often he's been unfaithful to have at least 2 women end up pregnant. My half-sister and I now call 23andMe 23andMark, because who knows how many more kids he might have out there. Pretty sure he's been terrified since at-home DNA kits became a thing. Story 24. My grandma actually legally disowned my mother for marrying my dad. The family house was supposed to go to my mom, but after the disowning, Grandma never specified who she wanted the house to go to, which led to a decades-long family feud that still divides us today. The sad part is, my parents ended up divorced after 20 years of marriage. My mom took care of Grandma until the end and was the one who handled all the funeral arrangements when she passed 2 years ago. She never asked for the house back, even though it's worth millions. No one told me any of this until I turned 30. Story 25. My grandmother ran off, had an affair, and got pregnant. She returned to my grandfather, and they raised the baby girl together as their own. My father and his siblings didn't find out the truth until they were older. I'm not sure if my aunt ever knew before she passed away. There's also a rumor about another half-sibling out there, so it seems my grandfather may have been involved in an affair as well. Looks like it was a time of affairs all around. Story 26. Edit. Just to clarify, Terry, Isis, and Joan are pseudonyms. Please don't go trying to find every woman named Joan. Now, onto the story. When I was a teenager, I heard that my cousin Terry's engagement had fallen apart right before their wedding, and that's all anyone really cared to share about it. As I got older, I learned more. Terry and Joan got engaged after she became pregnant, and at first, things were fine. But just 2 weeks before the wedding, Terry's mom, Isis, became seriously ill and nearly died. I can't remember exactly what it was, but it was years before COVID. Terry asked Joan to delay the wedding until Isis was better so she could attend. Instead, Joan called off the wedding over the phone. The really shocking part was when Terry went to her home and found it completely emptied out. All of Joan's things were gone, even the bed. Terry tried reaching out to Joan, but there was no answer. He called her family, but they didn't know anything either. He went to her parents' house and found it vacant. No note, no explanation. All of Joan's social media accounts were deleted, and their phone numbers were disconnected. It was like they had vanished. Later, Terry discovered that Joan and her family had packed up everything and moved across the country. They even planned to move overseas, but Terry caught up with them. Joan had tried to leave the country with their baby, just because Terry wanted his mom to be at the wedding. This went on for 3 years. After a long legal battle, Terry won primary custody of his child. He's now a single dad who cherishes every moment with his kid. I don't know what happened to Joan, and I'm not even going. Story 27. I found out the real reason my mom's parents divorced wasn't because they fell out of love, but because my grandfather had an affair with another married woman from their church. Their families had known each other for years, and my mom was close friends with the other woman's children. Less than a year after their respective divorces, my grandfather and the other woman got married, each with 3 kids. It was especially tragic because my step-grandmother's children had a rough time. Neither she nor her ex-husband were functional adults, so their kids grew up fast. The oldest daughter ended up being like a second mom and made it just 12, since their dad refused to help out. My biological grandmother, bless her, never told anyone about this. When I told her I knew, she just smiled and nodded, almost like it was a relief to finally share the secret. I can't imagine keeping something like that to yourself for so long, especially when you couldn't even tell your kids that the divorce wasn't your fault and that it turned their lives upside down. I learned all of this while helping with my step-grandmother's hospice care last fall. She was always chatty, but the end-of-life medication really brought out a lot more talking. It was pretty shocking, especially since my grandfather is such a laid-back, kind, straight-laced church guy. You'd never suspect him of cheating. The worst part is that I told my mom about it, and it was clear she had no idea. I really wish I could take that moment back. Edit. Just to clarify, my step-grandmother's daughter wasn't literally a mom at 12, but her dad refused to cook or clean, so that responsibility fell to the women in the house, including his daughters. And yes, my step-grandmother was the other woman. We had a good relationship, but I know it would have been different had I known what I know now. It sucks when things like this change how you see people. I still love both my grandparents, but damn, the pain they caused their kids in the name of love really hit hard. Story 28. I really hated the ages when I started learning all of this. I found out my dad was extremely abusive to my mom before they divorced, and I recently learned he might have hit me on one occasion too. After the divorce, we lived in a hostel, though it was a better than average one. My dad was in the army, and I don't fully get the details, but whatever. It kind of felt like a caravan park. I asked my mom not long ago why we stayed there so long, and she told me we pretty much had nothing and were just living in a hostel. I also found out that my great-granddad was a pedophile who abused my mom, and when she told her mom, my nan, she didn't believe her. Honestly, it feels like my mom's life has been one struggle after another. Story 29. My father was a dentist, just like his stepfather, and they shared an office until my grandfather passed away when I was 5. Dad worked in the front office, while the back office was kept in perfect condition but seemed to go unused, at least to me. I thought it was out of respect for his stepmother, who continued living above the office. Years later, I was comparing some old dental instruments with my younger brother. I showed him a large, curved forceps and asked what the hell it was used for. "Oh, didn't you know? He used to do abortions in the back office," he said. I didn't know, but suddenly so many things made sense. The late nights at the office, the cash payments, and the bartered items patients often brought in. I was too innocent when I left for college to be let in on his secret, but my younger brother, who stayed at home, wasn't. At first, I was shocked, but then that shock gave way to pride. There's nothing good about illegal abortions, except when they're desperately needed by people with few resources. My father had a reputation for kindness and flexibility when it came to billing. If you needed work done, it would get done, and done well. See this temporary bridge? Doc put that in 15 years ago, and I never had to go back, one patient said. He was an unhappy dentist with a surgeon's hands, but surgery wasn't an option for black men in the 40s. I imagine he provided quality health services to hundreds of women who might have ended up in the ER, or worse, without him. Anti-abortionists, please hold your fire. This is just a memory and reflection. Story 30. I found out when I was 15 that my father wasn't my biological dad. I'd always had a difficult relationship with him, and growing up, I was treated differently than my siblings. My biological father had left when he found out my mom was pregnant. After 3 years of wondering, I finally tracked him down. I found out where his brother worked and left a message explaining who I was and that I wanted to connect. The letter was given to him at his other brother's funeral. Eventually, he reached out to me, and we met up. It seemed to go okay at first. The first red flag should have been that he kept my number on his work phone only. He didn't want his kids to know, saying they were all in a good place at the time. He also said his wife didn't want me to contact his family. I suspect he never told her. We met up for 3 months, grabbing coffee from McDonald's drive-thru. But after that, he stopped responding to my messages. The ironic part? He walked out on me twice. I'm a better father to my kids than he could ever dream of being. Story 31. My grandmother grew up in a conservative, rural village in Belgium. When she was 18, during a local fair, she had an adventure in the bushes, just as any young woman would. A few weeks later, she found out she was pregnant. She tried to keep it hidden from her family and the tight-knit community for as long as she could, but eventually, it was impossible to conceal. When it became clear she would have a child out of wedlock, she became a public enemy. She was booed, insulted, and her house was pelted with stones. Her parents were constantly shamed, called sinners. Essentially, she was cast out of her village for daring to have premarital relations. As a single mother, she had to start over on the other side of the country. There, she met my grandfather, who accepted her child as his own. My father came along much later, and it wasn't until after my grandfather passed away that he found out the truth, that his brother was actually his half-brother. It was something that was never spoken about in the family. My father often tells me how much tenacious my grandmother was. It was highly unconventional for a woman to work in an office at that time, but she did. She was a career woman before it was even a thing. After my grandfather's death, my grandmother returned to her childhood village. It felt like some kind of quiet revenge to me. She remarried in her old age to a man she had loved when she was 18, and she looked absolutely stunning. She was the proudest woman I've ever known. A feminist without trying. She just didn't give a damn. May she rest in peace. Story 32. My grandfather had two families. In the mid-1970s, my grandfather was a 44-year-old ceramics professor and head of the art department at a private university in my hometown. At the time, he was married to my grandmother, and they had 5 kids, ranging from 6 to 17 years old. In 1976, he divorced my grandmother after confessing that he had been having an affair with a student 22 years younger than him, and she had gotten pregnant. He married the woman he was having an affair with, and they had 3 daughters together. They're still married today. So, my mother has 3 half-sisters, and I consider them my aunts. The youngest one is only 1 year older than I am. I'm 30, and my grandfather is now 88. After the divorce, my grandma raised all 5 kids on her own, living in poverty while dealing with multiple sclerosis. Despite my grandpa being an absolute jerk, she stayed close friends with him until her passing in 2008. Before she passed away, we'd always have Thanksgiving and Christmas dinners together as one big, messed-up family. It's just hitting me now that she was the one keeping us all together. Story 33. I wasn't exactly let in on it, but as I got older, I realized my dad was bisexual. My mom passed away from breast cancer when I was 5, and shortly after that, he would invite Uncle Boffle, a male flight attendant who was a friend of his, over to our house. They'd hang out, have drinks, and chat late into the night in the living room, then head to the bedroom. Sometimes, I'd hear the bed creak. This was in the late 80s to early 90s, so there was no internet or cultural context to explain what was going on. At the time, I didn't think much of it, and the visits stopped when I was around 9. A year later, my dad remarried. Around the same time, when I was about 10, I sneaked into their bedroom and found a stack of straight and gay magazines, all filled with explicit stories. I was a big reader back then, so I devoured anything I could get my hands on. I didn't really understand what I was reading, but I knew I probably shouldn't have been. It wasn't until much later, when I was in my 20s, that it all clicked. The pieces fell into place, and the realization hit me hard. Back then, he was a bit of a Christian fundamentalist, not the stone the gays kind of guy, but definitely someone who'd said his share of things about it. Story 34. My mom once told me that she believes her cousin is actually her sister. When she was a child, she caught my grandfather and my grandaunt in bed together. After that, my grandaunt moved away to another city, and when she returned, she had a baby. She claimed the baby was from a relationship with a man she met there. But here's the thing. This baby was the only one of her children who looked exactly like my mother and me. People often get confused when they hear us talk on the phone, because they can't tell who's who just by the voice. Another thing my mom shared with me is that my grandmother lost 2 children, one due to neglect and the other through a miscarriage. That's part of the reason she struggled with depression. Story 35. My family's story around the time of the Vietnam War is a complicated one. My grandma once told me that she found my mom on the streets and took her in as an adopted child. My mom was mistreated throughout her childhood, forced to do all the housework, cook for everyone, do laundry, and was beaten for any small mistake or sometimes for no reason at all. Since she wasn't blood, she was treated like the family servant. Fast forward to the Amerasian program, which allowed children born to U.S. fathers to come to the States. My mom fit that description. She didn't look fully Vietnamese. She was approved to come and came pregnant with me, leaving my father behind. I was told my father just couldn't come, but the truth was that it was a choice between him or my grandma accompanying her. My mom, fearing that being married would jeopardize her chances of coming to the U.S., told the embassy that I didn't have a father. A few years ago, my grandma passed away on Christmas and, on her deathbed, she confessed that my mom was actually her biological child. She told us that my mom came from her own womb. She had disappeared for almost a year because her cousin had set her up to be essayed by an American, and she was too ashamed to tell her husband. Instead, she made up the story that she found my mom. I later did a 23andMe DNA test, always knowing something about my mom, and I was a bit off. I'm almost 6 feet tall, way taller than the average Vietnamese woman. It turned out I'm only 73% Vietnamese, The rest of my DNA is mixed with Scandinavian, British, Irish, and more. No one on 23andMe has a close match to me, just distant cousins. And my mom doesn't want to explore it further given how painful that history is for her. Her biological father is someone who may not even be worth finding, and he's probably long gone anyway. On the plus side, no one in my family can outdrink me. I may have a bit of an alcohol problem. Story 36. My grandma was apparently involved in some scandalous cult in the Fresno area, led by a crazy leader who hooked up with many of the women in the group. It's disturbing to think about the implications of that. On top of that, she has some wild beliefs. She thinks chemtrails are real, refuses to wear a mask, and believes that Obama isn't truly American, but is an evil Muslim from Kenya trying to impose Sharia law on the U.S. Her proof is that a U.S. flag with a gold fringe means it's military property, so any building with such a flag is technically under martial law, giving Obama the power to unalive anyone at will. She also thinks that because the hospital where Obama was born in Hawaii changed its name, his birth certificate must be a fake and he's from Kenya. Despite all this, she insists she's not racist. She just believes that equality is a bad thing. Because if everyone were equal, we'd all be equally miserable under the rule of the shadow government, which she believes is controlled by rich Illuminati Jews who will force socialism on us. Story 37. My grandfather and his first girlfriend were deeply in love, having started dating when they were around 16. But one day, in their 20s, my grandfather heard a rumor. This was in the 1950s, that his girlfriend had entertained some unknown men at her apartment. They fought, broke up, and almost immediately, my grandma swooped in and married him. They had 3 kids together, but my grandpa never stopped loving his ex, who also married and had children of her own. When my mom, their youngest, moved out, my grandparents divorced, and my grandpa and his ex got back together. They lived together until her passing a few years ago. My maternal grandmother struggled with alcoholism, and though I loved her deeply, she wasn't exactly a good person. She passed away when I was 10, about 18 years ago. Recently, my mom told me that my grandma, while drunk, confessed to starting the rumor that tore my grandpa and his ex apart because she wanted him all to herself. My mom says we can never be sure since it was in a drunken state. But if it's true, it means I only exist because my grandma was a jealous woman who broke up a couple that was truly meant for each other. When I first heard this, I felt a deep internal conflict. Story 38. My cousin didn't attend the University of Oxford, nor did he spend half his life working for a Fortune 500 company in England. He was a high school dropout who mooched off his parents, girlfriends, and my grandmother. The truth only came out at my grandmother's funeral. He wasn't happy when she decided to donate everything she owned to charity, and he made a scene right in front of her coffin. My uncle, his father, slapped him hard across the face and then just blurted everything out. Apparently, my grandmother had known the truth all along, but because my cousin was her first grandchild and grandson, she decided to protect him by playing along and lying to all of us. Growing up, my grandmother would constantly compare us to him, the so-called golden boy of the family. If our grades weren't up to her standards, or if we misbehaved, she'd remind us in the harshest terms how stupid we were and how we should be more like our cousin, who was studying and working hard in England. To be honest, I didn't shed a tear at her funeral. For anyone wondering, my grandmother rented a condo for him to stay in all those years while he was supposedly in England. He was given thousands of dollars a month to live comfortably and stay away from all of us. This lasted for almost 15 years. None of us ever suspected a thing. Story 39. My mom and dad were always separated, and I don't have a single memory of them being together. But they always seemed to get along, never fought, and I had a good relationship with my dad. My mom encouraged that bond and did most of the driving to make sure I could see him. I never heard either of them say anything negative about the other. When I turned 18, I got curious about their past and started asking questions about their relationship. That's when I found out that my dad cheated on my mom while she was pregnant with me, and she left him afterward. My mom never wanted to tell me this because she didn't want me to hate my dad or cut off my relationship with him. The fact that I went 18 years without knowing any of this, and that my mom never once badmouthed my dad and made sure I saw him, is truly mind-blowing. She's an incredibly strong and powerful woman, and I'm lucky to have her as my role model. Story 40. Growing up, I never understood why my dad was always going to meetings on Sundays for work, or why most of his friends seemed kind of sketchy, though still really nice, or why he had those weird scars. As I got older, I found out that my dad had struggled with a 20-year cocaine and drinking problem. Most of his old friends used to sell drugs with him. The scars? They were from all the drunken or high car accidents, or that one time when my mom threatened to leave him with my sister, and he ended up stabbing himself. She didn't leave, and they're still together. The meetings he attended were his NA/AA sessions, and he's been sober since before I was born. Over time, I've learned more stories, like why our close family friend Norman got deported back to Jamaica, or why many of his old friends struggled to find steady jobs because of their criminal records. All of it goes back to the cocaine and drinking. What really messes with me, though, is that even though my dad was at the center of all this, he never got arrested because he was white, while most of his friends, who were black, ended up in jail at some point. That's why now, even after he's successful and retired, and even before, he gives a lot of his money to his friends. He helps them find jobs, pays for their mortgages or rent, and supports them in ways he can. Story 41. I'm not sure how true this is, because it sounds a bit far-fetched, but it's kind of believable, and honestly, I really hope it's not real. I was told that my dad's father, a well-known Sri Lankan doctor, at least, based on what I gathered from his funeral, supposedly discovered a cure for asthma over 30 years ago while he was researching treatments for something else. He tried to submit his findings to the relevant medical organizations, but either he didn't get the credit he deserved, or they refused to name the medication after him or his family. Out of spite or pride, he apparently decided to keep it to himself and never made the discovery public, dying with the knowledge. My dad told me this when I was about 16, and at the time, I thought my grandpa was justified, since that's how the story was presented to me. But a few years later, when I asked again, clearly frustrated with grandpa, my dad just brushed me off in a way that made it clear he didn't want to talk about it. Story 42. My father left my mother shortly after we moved to Florida. He had moved first to get a job and find us a place. I was around 10 or 11 at the time. It turned out he left her for another woman that my uncle had set him up with, because my uncle had a long-standing desire to be with my mother. When I found out at 18, I drove to his house and punched him at his front door. The sudden separation devastated my mother, and I couldn't just let that go. I was arrested and went through a bitter legal battle, but all charges were dropped due to lack of evidence and witnesses. When he passed away, I went to his grave and pissed on it. On top of that, I learned that 2 of my other uncles share their wives with each other, and one of my aunts even has a child by the other uncle. Story 43. This isn't particularly dark, but when I was in grade school, my parents went on vacation with some friends for a NASCAR race, and I stayed with my grandparents. When they returned, I overheard parts of conversations about my dad getting arrested. I asked what happened, and was told he was arrested for smashing a bunch of Oreos on a picnic table. It sounded strange, but I figured it must be illegal to smash cookies in Delaware. It was a big deal at the time because my dad had to miss work to make the 8-hour drive back for his court date 2 weeks later. As I got older, I learned the full story. They were staying at a state park, and if you've ever been to one, you know they have quiet hours, meaning you can't be loud after 9 or 10 p.m. Well, around 11:30, my dad and his friends were pretty drunk, and one of his friends jumped up on the picnic table and started stomping on cookies, laughing and yelling. State park police showed up to tell them to quiet down, and friend number 2 had his weed and pot out on the table. Since the campsite was registered under my dad's name, he got a charge too. They were locked up overnight until they could see the judge and either get released on bail or just agree to show up for their court date. I assume a possession charge wouldn't need bail. 2 weeks later, they all had to return for court, but the charges were dropped. Story 44. My maternal grandfather wasn't actually my real grandfather. It turns out my maternal grandmother had quite a reputation and slept around a lot. 2 of her 5 children, including my mom, were from different fathers. I never met my biological grandfather, and it's likely I never will meet my biological aunts, uncles, and cousins. In a strange twist, this turned out to be good news. My presumed grandfather, not the biological one, had Huntington's disease. Huntington's is a destructive, degenerative neurological condition that often transforms people into shadows of themselves, and it's genetic, so it has a high chance of being passed down. All of my mom's older siblings have it, And they're all not only severely affected, but also mean and erratic. My mom doesn't have it, and neither does her younger brother, because they have different fathers. The Huntington's affected grandfather went on to end his second wife after he divorced my grandmother. He was also a staunch racist and a card-carrying member of the KKK. In the end, I'm actually thankful my grandmother had her affairs and slept with other men, because I dodged a huge bullet by not inheriting those awful genes. Story 45. My mom passed away from cancer when I was 19, not super young, but still young enough to be thrown into a whirlwind. We had a very close relationship, which, oddly enough, my father and older brother resented for various reasons. When she died, I was shocked to find out that she had apparently left me nothing. It was like I was on my own, disconnected from my dad and brother. They, on the other hand, seemed to move on just fine. My dad suddenly had money to start a classic car dealership, and my brother moved into a fancy high-rise in Miami, supposedly thanks to a job he landed straight out of law school. 6 hard, struggling years later, I was cleaning out an old family storage unit looking for things from the house we sold after my mom's passing. I came across a bin of my dad's paperwork, including my mom's funeral file. I thought maybe I'd finally find the answer to why everyone else seemed to suddenly have money after mom died. But I didn't expect what I found. She had left all of us equal shares of a multi-million-dollar life insurance policy. But my dad and brother had colluded to cut me out. Somehow, the hometown bank had allowed my dad to cash all the checks, and he gave my share to my brother. In the end, my dad had to sell the business to pay me back and avoid going to jail. My brother no longer lives in that fancy Miami apartment, and I haven't heard from either of them since. Story 46. My father's side of the family kicked my parents and me out of the house so his sisters could take the property for themselves. They essentially made a 5-year-old child, his mother, and father homeless to seize the property that rightfully belonged to my grandfather. They manipulated my grandfather into believing my parents didn't have his best interests at heart, all to take control of the property. My grandmother had suffered a stroke years before, so she couldn't speak up or defend us. In the end, a property that should have gone to me, the grandson, ended up going to my aunt's daughter. Now, she's pretty lonely, no husband, no children, and not in the best shape. Karma has a funny way of working, though, and everything tends to work out for the best. Fortune truly favors the brave. Thank you for watching. If you enjoyed this video, be sure to give it a thumbs up, subscribe, and hit the bell icon so you never miss an update.